All right. Thanks everybody for joining us today. We've got an interesting topic that is top of mind to all businesses in the Lubbock, Texas market. We're about to go through a seismic change here in the market. The Lubbock area is going to be joining the ERCOT RTO in regards to electricity production. And there's going to be just a host of changes coming up for everybody, one way or another. So our customers look to us for guidance and instruction and some insight into the energy markets. And we're getting asked regularly, what does this mean for me, this upcoming change? So we thought we would put together a panel discussion and just go over some of the information you might not have been aware of in the market. So today during our conversation, we're going to talk about the recent energy market as a whole. So not just here locally, but the recent energy market and then what we see going forward. We're going to talk about ERCOT, specifically the grid reliability and what you can expect in regards to that. We're going to discuss energy procurement options that give you price protection, provide you with flexibility to take advantage of market volatility. And then we're going to go into some ancillary grid relief programs that are available that can offset, sometimes completely, the cost of full facility backup power that companies need, those companies that are power dependent. And then we're going to share some insights into some managed service options that you have available to you in the marketplace that can help you focus strictly on your core business and leave the energy to a partner. So today we have Barry Rogers with us, and Barry is the operations director for Exergy Energy. Barry, could you give a little introduction to the audience in regards to your background and some of the expertise that you leverage?
Yeah, sure thing. First of all, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, coming through great.
Okay, great. Yeah, so I started out my career at the Public Service Company of New Mexico. So that's in the Western Electric Coordinating Council, the Western Interconnection, as a real-time trader. So that's kind of someone who's helping operate in real time the power assets on the grid. So we would dispatch generation and we would forecast load, we would control for all those things. Public Service Company New Mexico had a subsidiary company in Texas called Optum Energy, and I went to go work for them for several years. So I spent the better part of a decade in Texas trading that market, watching it grow up, adopt the nodal market, change from system-wide offer caps to being a few thousand to 9,000 back to 5,000. Seen it go through several changes, seen 30,000 megawatts of wind come online, and now we're seeing a whole lot of solar. And now we're seeing flexible loads with crypto. And now you have Lubbock that's also coming into the mix here, joining the grid. So a lot of changes have happened in short order. As you can imagine, the Texas economy just booming. So it's really brought about a lot of change and growth. And it's one of the more dynamic, interesting markets on the grid. But you have to know how to navigate it. It's volatile by design, as people may or may not be aware. And those who lived through Winter Storm Uri can certainly attest to. So it certainly helps to have professional help when navigating this market.
Yeah, and from your role, especially in the the day-to-day finger on the pulse, trading the energy markets, you kind of have that bird's eye view of seeing all the different components that really affect pricing.
Yeah, absolutely. It's where the rubber meets the road, and price it's more than just a price. It is an actual indicator of kind of scarcity in the market, so to speak. It's your supply and your demand balance. So being a trader in the market, you have to have firsthand knowledge of how that market functions.
So when you're talking to companies that, in the past, they've just had a local utility that sets a tariff rate, and I really don't need to dive too deeply into what's going on in the energy market because it doesn't really matter what my opinions are. I'm getting my energy from one source. So as you talk to a company like that, what are some things you can kind of share about, not specifically local to Lubbock or local to ERCOT, but, just the energy market as a whole? What have you seen, recently, and the condition that the market's in, and then, some things that you might see going forward, the energy market as a whole?
Sure. So kind of addressing that on a couple fronts, just to sort of say, utilities operate differently from what we'd call independent power producers. This is more kind of the utility version in the competitive market, so to speak. It's the generation side of things. So the driving factors between them, while a lot is shared, a lot is also different. A utility is going to pass along basically their cost of doing business. So they're not necessarily incentivized to make the best deals and produce the most efficient power plants, or it might not necessarily be in their wheelhouse despite being a power company. You know, Lubbock Power and Light, not a massive size utility. They're probably not building power plants regularly. So when they have to build one, it's a little bit perhaps out of their wheelhouse, or there might be people that are better suited for it. So that's to say we're all operating in this environment where we're dealing with similar commodities and similar technology, but under different circumstances. So that being said, what you're looking at some of the markets on a whole, as many people are aware, last year, the situation in Ukraine coupled with inflation really drove up the prices of energy. And that was kind of sustained a lot through much of last year. But we had a relatively mild winter, knock on wood, for a lot of reasons. Europe in particular became very short on supply of natural gas. They were relying a lot on the liquefied natural gas produced in the United States in order to sort of fulfill their needs. However, when winter hits, as we all know, we burn more natural gas. We use it in our furnaces and other devices and in power generation, right? So a mild winter actually meant that we didn't draw too much out of our supply of natural gas, which is great because supply was a bit tight-headed into winter. So now that we've pretty much exited into winter, once we hit March, that's kind of the last of the withdrawal season for gas. We're looking like we have some stability in that market, and it's kind of made prices come down. So whereas last year we were kind of telling clients, you know, well, we wouldn't enter into any more long-term contracts or longer-term contracts, you're sort of seeing the market come back into a range where it's like, okay, prices are getting a little more reasonable.
Yeah. So the big change. Thankfully, we had that light winter because, you know, when we're supplying the natural gas for Western Europe and Germany, not just for the United States, it puts a little crimp on the supply.
Gas has become a global commodity. That's one thing that's changed pretty significantly in the last decade. With, you know, it used to be more of a domestic supplier. Perhaps people even remember when hurricanes in the Gulf really drove the price of oil and gas, and then it turned to like shale development, which is more onshore. So those Gulf formations didn't really matter as much. The dynamic is constantly shifting.
Yeah. So now, you know, that's kind of the energy market as a whole. Can you kind of just walk through, you know, for people that wouldn't be familiar with it, you know, what is an RTO? How does it play? What's the difference between ERCOT and some of the other transmission organizations around the country, and what makes ERCOT different?
Well, it's interesting because I don't want to necessarily conflate two terms here because they're not mutually exclusive, but there's an RTO, which is a regional transmission organization, and ISO, which is an independent system operator. So where Lubbock is currently perhaps in an RTO called SPP, maybe they're sort of the identifying more as an ISO these days. The ISO market is a little bit more dynamic. So let me step back for a second and explain how those two are similar but not the same. But what they basically refer to is a region within the country, that a control area that is monitored by a certain entity, in this case ERCOT, that balances basically the supply and demand and controls for the imports and exports coming out of that control area. So they're really tasked with maintaining system reliability. Now, the ERCOT control area is a bit different because it is electrically disconnected from the rest of the United States. So you have the Western interconnection, you got the Eastern interconnection, and you got ERCOT. And actually, ERCOT's even the whole state of Texas, and the state of Texas actually has components, has parts of Houston in the Eastern connection, El Paso's in the Western interconnection. So it's very unique in that respect. But it does make for a more volatile market. It is, and that is by design. It is because when you're just within your own state, you get exempt from a lot of federal oversight. So it's no accident that Texas is designed this way, and it's allowed them to sort of develop this competitive market that sure, it's had volatility, but generally speaking, it's brought innovation and it's brought cheaper pricing.
Yeah, and that volatility has been a learning opportunity, like with the superstorm, opportunity to learn, where the deficiencies were and put a fix in place. So, if I'm in the Lubbock area and power generation is lacking and we don't have enough supply, another part of the ERCOT territory can fill that gap.
Well, that's generally how it always works. So actually, if you look at where Lubbock is, it's in the panhandle of Texas, and the whole west side of Texas, there is not much load in terms of population density, right?
Yeah.
You get some industrial load in like the Permian Basin, a lot of that because of the oil drilling that happens there. But generally speaking, the population is quite limited. And so what it does have a lot of is natural resources. I already alluded to the Permian. You get cheap gas and oil coming out of there, but then you have abundant solar and wind resources. So really they're in this region that's got a ton of power generation and not so much demand. But the rest of ERCOT is basically taking transmission across from that region to the central, eastern, northern parts of and southern parts of the state to supply that electricity to everyone else. Important to note that ERCOT's got about 30,000 megawatts of wind, and the vast majority of it is in West Texas and the Panhandle.
Yeah, so if I'm in an area where all this wind power is being produced and it's really cheap, and we have more than the power that we need locally, then am I good as far as my costing should be super low and I should have super reliable power, or is that not the case?
Well, so the problem is your power.
Well,
It like go figure. Like everything else, it's complicated. Yeah, I mean, obviously renewables, we can't control the wind. We can adjust wind turbines, kind of move the pitch. I got a blade right over here, where it's spinning less, so you can kind of control for that. But we can't just create wind either. You know what I mean? Yeah. So that region benefits from times where it's maybe generally cheaper electricity to when this wind disappears in an instant and you get price spikes of volatility. The other thing to note is that all this renewable capacity doesn't necessarily bring along I call it sort of electrical infrastructure that a more thermal traditional power plant does. You also need things like voltage support. You got to be sure you have all those adequate resources to get the power where it's going and have the right amount of voltage and everything else required. So it does mean that it could add some volatility to the region, and people need to be aware of that.
Yeah, and now if I'm in an organization that's in that territory and I'm going to become a part of Lubbock, and I'm a company or an organization that has to be up and running. So let's say it's a nursing home where it's a life or death issue if power goes out. It's a school, where we don't want the impact of, shutting things down and sending students home. Manufacturing company that if power goes out, we lose all of our product and we don't meet our delivery timelines. Can you speak a little bit about ERCOT's grid reliability, kind of in a general sense?
Sure. I don't want to scare folks on ERCOT because it obviously had about the worst PR year you could have a couple of years ago in 2021, right? ERCOT it's different because of this competitive market. They've built efficient power plants. They built them on a budget and they got power to people cheaply. What they didn't do is spend tens of millions of dollars extra to winterize, where someone, like I know you're in the Illinois region, that would just be a given. You don't build a power plant out there with winterizing it, right? ERCOT, it's like, well, okay, 1 in 10, 20, 100 years. I've heard so many different numbers on how often a storm like this could occur. You don't necessarily spend that kind of capital. So that was sort of a learning process for ERCOT. It's sort of, you look at, I think a lot of pure capitalisms go through this. You kind of let the chains off, things grow, it's great, but you need a little bit of regulation to keep it in check. So what's happened is we had to come in and kind of regulate that winterization needed to occur to kind of prevent some of the problems of 2021. And I think a lot of that has been addressed. It's still a work in progress, but I wouldn't expect something on that level to happen again. Now, isolated incidents occur. People probably in the Austin area, you might have heard, lost power for like a good week. Now, that was more transmission related, and that's what the vast majority of outages really are. You think about a tornado ripping up above ground transmission lines, that sort of thing. What happened in 2011 or 2021, excuse me, 2011 was the other banner year in ERCOT. 2021 was we just lost all this generating capacity, and that's typically not what happens. So gas pipelines froze, you couldn't get the fuel source to the power plants. All of that basically had to come offline, And in order to maintain the balance between supply and demand, which you have to do in the electrical market, they had to shed firm load, which means taking off customer usage so that they could maintain, several people were blacked out for the better part of a week so they could maintain what was left of the power grid. Now, I don't see that being necessarily the problem going forward. I think they're going to be more isolated incidents. When capacity gets to be a problem, it's like in the heat of the afternoon in August and the wind isn't there and we're using every last megawatt we have. So
Yeah.
what's kind of filling that gap now is demand response, which is basically taking actively, signing up to take demand off rather than being forced into it, which was happening in Europe. And people will get paid a capacity payment for participating in these programs in ERCOT. You can also have distributed energy resources. So these are basically smaller generators, batteries, flywheels, reciprocating engines that are located throughout the grid and can help provide support in these emergency scenarios. They're not like a typical power plant that would run all the time. They're basically like a backup function. The grid is tight. You turn this on, you're helping the grid. They're giving you a capacity payment for doing it. It's sort of a win-win. And a lot of these businesses that are in manufacturing and that sort of thing, that's really where they can benefit. That, they might want a backup generator anyway, because at any given time, anyone who's lived in Texas, you get tornadoes and pretty nasty thunderstorms and things of that nature that could tear up the transmission time. And so that can happen basically anywhere.
Yeah.
And then they're also the grid is incentivizing you to help them out by buying one of these generators. So there's certainly programs that exist, and companies like Exergy help guide other companies through that process.
So you start talking about some complexity that your average customer isn't used to. So the two energy components in front of the meter, which is your energy you're getting from the grid and from your utility, and then the energy mix that's behind the meter. So as you see energy demand increasing, which across the board, you see some pretty dramatic estimates of 48% increase in energy demand in the next 20 years, which is that's that much time. And you've already got a taxed out grid. As they continue to build energy supply, and then hopefully at the same time are doing their best to address energy transmission lines that can carry that increased load. Do you see that distributed energy resource, or the ability for the customer to provide their own power? Do you see the grid and organizations like ERCOT providing more incentives for customers to do that, or fewer as we move forward and in this migration we're a part of?
Absolutely. The pace at which things move now is crazy. Like I said, I've been doing this for a long time. You build a power plant, a traditional power plant, you're talking about a multi-year time frame, right? You got to go out there and you have to site it, and you have to make sure that you have adequate transmission resources, adequate fuel resources. So that might be siting a gas pipeline, that might require eminent domain, that all of this regulatory paperwork. It can take years, and cost overruns can be in the hundreds of millions. Well, now you can sort of build scalable solar, scalable wind, right? That gets developed very quickly on a time frame relative to a thermal power plant. But that's sort of only adding somewhat reliable capacity, right? Because ultimately we're still not controlling for the sun and the wind. The other problem is, the other very dynamic factor now is you look at flexible loads, or loads that can come on very quickly. The load put on by a server or a crypto miner is insane. It's like a manufacturing facility, right? Like a smelter or something. It's kind of crazy when you compare it to manufacturing, what we're traditionally see for industrial load, and how quickly these basically computer systems can use massive amounts of electricity. So now we're kind of vying with that. We have load that can come on, a lot of it all at once. Whereas, it used to be you'd see like a refinery. That's also several years in the process of building, and you're kind of co-building a power plant to accommodate it at the same time. It's all fast, it's all flexible. Trying to keep pace with that is going to be difficult, because you're not only controlling for the load anymore, you can't control your generation like you once could, because it's a renewable resource. So now what do you need? You need something like batteries to sort of harness that wind that tends to blow more off peak, and put it into on-peak hours. You need flexible demand, like I said, the demand response resources that can come off during peak times, and distributed energy resources, which can also be installed very quickly. It's sort of like putting a mobile home in. You just kind of put it on the site and install. It's not, a year's siting process. And then those can provide that incremental power that we need. So the problem is we need that last megawatt on an afternoon in August, or we don't have enough, right?
Yeah.
That's how power plants are typically built. And that's why that if we can just get that little part, shave off the demand, add a little bit of generation, then we can push out years what we need.
Yeah.
In terms
and
of larger power plants.
The customer finds himself in the interesting position of being part of the answer to their own problem. And
Absolutely.
that's,
and providing themselves with added reliability and resiliency.
yeah, absolutely. And again, for those who are new to, programs like this, the grid needs customers to do this. So it's not just a situation where they make it available to you, they incentivize you to do this. And they're more than happy to do that, because the other option for them is to invest an enormous amount of capital in long-term projects to build, that same capacity. Whereas they can incentivize you as the customer to take your load off of the grid, and it comes in cheaper for them. And we see that in the industry, we see that increasing as opposed to slowing down.
I mean, Lubbock Power and Light cited that specifically as the reason they wanted to go to ERCOT. They were faced with building a $700 million power plant. I think they probably put it through an RFP process where they get different builders to bid on it. But nonetheless, that has to get passed along to the Lubbock ratepayer. And that might have not been the best decision, because building a power plant because you need power isn't always the best decision. Sometimes you can just go buy that power. And that's basically what they saw with ERCOT. It's like, well, let's put them in the competitive market. And now we can get that provided at a much cheaper cost.
Yeah, and then their responsibility falls back to the infrastructure and maintaining the infrastructure for the electricity locally.
That's correct. Yeah, they will still maintain the wires.
So customer who is now, they're transitioning away from what they've always had, and they're getting phone calls from every energy, broker and supplier in the world right now. What are some things that you can share, from I'm a customer, I'm in procurement at a manufacturer, or I'm responsible for facilities at a high school, local high school. What are some things that I should be thinking about or factoring in when I'm fielding these calls, when I'm reaching out to providers, to look for an energy plan?
So one thing to note is I believe Lubbock set up a few default providers, right? So if you weren't to sign up on, you're going to be sort of forced onto the competitive market, whether you like it or not. But what you'll end up is with a default provider. And a default provider is going to be a fairly well-known name, like a TXU or a Reliant, which is NRG. I think those are two of the default providers they have. But these default providers don't have an incentive to give you the best deal. In fact, they're almost disincentivized from doing that because you just ended up with them, right? You didn't go and shop it around. You're just paying whatever the rate is. So you do need to understand that you can enter into a contract with different providers, that there is a competitive marketplace. Electricity is a commodity product. You really don't care who it comes from, right? Or even these guys who you're buying from aren't necessarily the ones generating it. That's important to know. Just it's not going to impact you operationally. So to go out into the competitive marketplace, it does take a little bit of knowledge and knowing how to navigate that marketplace and having a fundamental view on the market. As I said, prices have come down. Last year, we were advocating for shorter term contracts somewhere this year, but we're not still advocating for really long term contracts. So sort of being able to navigate that and know what your own load usage is very helpful. There's a number of factors that we help folks out with, and several things they need to know about themselves when they go to the market.
So if I'm going to the market, and I'm trying to obviously be as protective of our money as we can. We want to spend as little on energy as we possibly can because we have a different mission. How can I know that I'm protected from the index or the volatility of the market? When I go out and I ask for a contract, how can I know if I'm a business that I can be protected?
Yeah, so it's interesting when I talk to people in ERCOT, and sometimes I take it for granted how much they know their power grid relative to everybody else in the country,
Yeah.
essentially, because of what happened during Uri. They're very aware that the market had very volatile pricing. They're probably blissfully ignorant the rest of the time, but it became very apparent during that scenario. So people got kind of a crash course in market understanding. Now, the people of Lubbock maybe have been blissfully ignorant up until now too, but yeah, the market is volatile and there's different ways it's priced. So when you enter into a contract, you can have a fixed contract, which means that you're paying the set amount of a rate for power per kilowatt hour, and it's that rate for the duration of your contract. Or you can have a variable contract, and it can be variable in a number of respects. The one that was most hurtful during Uri was people were on the pure real-time index. So for years and years, generally speaking, I would say in some years more than others, the real time tended to be a discount to the day ahead. So that means buying the index rather than sort of locking in a fixed rate. So companies, there's one called Gritty, set up plans where they could buy on the index, and they were going to be making, or they weren't going to, in theory, they would pay less for electricity because they were on the real time index, rather than saying someone had gone out there and basically hedge the cost of that customer and lock them in at a rate. But this was very much akin to, I've heard it called picking up pennies in front of a steamroller. And people found that out during Uri, because
Yeah.
you had customers at their house. So this isn't a business, a person at their house might get a $2,000 bill for 1 day of power usage during Uri because they were on the variable index and it was $9,000 a megawatt hour. So all that's to say, don't get on the variable index. You might save a couple of cents, but not worth it. The risk inherent in this market is just too great.
Yeah.
As I said, you can sign up different terms: 3 months, 6 month, 12 month, 24 month. Be wary of terms less than a year and what months they cover. And what I mean by that is, if you look at a 3 month contract and it was, say, October, November, December, those are cheap months when you tend to not use much power. So someone could give you a rate that seems really, really cheap. However, June, July, and August, those are premium months, and they traded a very much a higher price than those other ones. So you just got to be weary of the contracts you're signing and what months they cover. It's a lot to navigate. As I've said, it really does help to have a professional help.
Yeah. And so if I'm going out on the market and for the first time I'm having to select a plan, for my energy, my electricity, I can get a locked-in rate, or I can be on the index and risk it to try to save a couple pennies and then be open to that, the risk. But let's say I am one of those companies that's energy dependent. I can't afford for the grid to go down even for a second. So I have full facility backup power. It might be a backup, natural gas generator. It might be, whatever that supply is, solar plus battery, whatever it is. But I have enough backup power on my facility that if I needed to, I could power my facility. Would that change the type of contract that I would want to get into for my energy purchase?
Yeah. Let me first start by saying, because I'd be remiss to not mention this. The other thing you have to be aware with the contracts is, as soon as they end, they will put you in a terrible rate. So keep an eye on your contract and when it ends.
Evergreen clause.
Yeah, because they're going to roll you into some crappy, like it's the teaser APR, and now here's the real one. So everyone just has to be wary of at least, shorter term contracts, and, keep an eye on your contract expiration.
Yeah.
Sorry, now back to your question. If you have a backup generator, you could procure what's called a block and index contract. Now, this is applicable to typically more, at least medium-sized CNI, or let's just say it helps to have at least 100 kilowatts, more like 200 to 500 kilowatts of load to do this. But anyway, you could get a supplier to provide you with what's called a block and index contract. And what that allows for is participation in the market. And what I mean is, let's say you're 100 kW load. Well, if during a high priced event, which signifies market shortage, tightness, a need in the market, you could run your generator. So you take your load basically off the grid and it's provided at the generator. Now that block contract could sell at the prevailing market price. So if you had a block contract at, let's say, $70 and price goes to 5,000, well, you're kind of pocketing that difference and you're staying online by running on the generator.
Yeah. So, the opportunity is there in the right market, and those programs are based on your locale. So if you're in, Lubbock, those programs could and probably are different than if your business is located in San Antonio or your business is located in Houston. So it is very specific to where your business is located, where you're drawing your power from. So it is important, like when you're making those decisions, to leverage the experience of a trusted partner. And that kind of brings us to that, the other piece of the conversation is, companies are used to the concept of managed service. So I'm not knowledgeable enough to know exactly what the best way to configure and to house and to support my servers for my IT department, in all of those aspects. So I outsource that, and I have somebody who's a managed service provider take care of that. So they're kind of used to the managed service concept. Can you talk a little bit about like an Exergy, a concierge utility, and that managed service, like the different things that you do for a customer, as they're looking at these complex decisions of what kind of power plan, can I leverage my backup power to participate in programs? Am I protected from both the reliability of the grid and then also from price volatility? So maybe talk a little bit about, like your role in the operations of a concierge utility, and kind of, what value you bring to the customer in those areas as they're trying to navigate these challenges.
Sure. Yeah. Exergy's wheelhouse is really C&I customers that with a need for a backup generator. Now we help a variety of businesses with other energy procurement needs. There could be solar and battery and things of that nature. But if I'm taking sort of, the base case of what we do in managing a commercial industrial customer with a backup generator, it all starts by understanding the customer first and their needs. If you are a plastics manufacturer, for instance, you use quite a bit of electricity, but your need for a backup generator is pretty intense, because if you have an outage, that plastic molding can harden up in the lines and it can cost you thousands of dollars. Not to mention that, you may be exposed in the grid in some way or shape or form, depending on how you set up your power purchases. So we help navigate them through that whole process. We start by looking at the customer, assessing their needs, looking at their interval load demand. We do engineering studies to make sure, what kind of generator is best? How would it integrate? Do they need ride through? Ride through is like in an emergency scenario when a generator comes offline, you might need a small battery to sort of fill that gap between when the generator starts. It's a variety of things we look at, and then we look at contract procurement. What would your facility qualify for in terms of demand response? There's cap, well, it's not cap in ERCOT, but there would be demand tag avoided. So there's transmission charges that occur on the grid, and if you can sort of take a power plant, if you could take a load off the grid during these times when they're measuring for demand charges, then you effectively avoid demand charges and avoided cost. So these are just a variety of things we look at every time we take a client on. And like you said, it varies regionally. I mean, the modern power grids are mostly this nodal market, which means that, every point of generation and load usage, there's difference. They're creating different prices. There's different congestions. There's different gas markets. It's a lot to navigate, and we basically help guide through that process.
So if I just wanted a plan that was just going to give me a locked-in rate and just kind of protect me, I could do that. But if I only do that, I'm leaving out a lot of opportunity to really get the most from my power environment as a whole.
Yes. I mean, it's going to matter on your business, right? Like I would look at a crypto miner and say, crypto miner isn't necessarily mission critical, maybe they view it differently, but if you were talking about a grid needing power at, let's say, 3 p.m. in August, a crypto miner might say, hey, guess what? I don't need to mine crypto for the next 3 hours. Let's take that demand off the grid, and they can, the grid's going to gain that. That's one way of doing it. What we do is we look at people who are, it's more mission critical. So let's say a nursing home, right? A nursing home might have emergency backup equipment. They might have life-saving equipment on site. They need to maintain power. So they could, through the backup generator, maintain power. They could also leverage that backup generator in the market and help provide, much needed power to the grid, and get paid an incentive to do so.
Yeah, and what I really like about the Exergy model is it's all seamless to the customer. We had an organization that we had installed, and the next week, the only way they knew their generator was running is the CEO happened to walk by the generator and hear it humming. And turns out somebody had run over a power pole not that far away, and their facility was down for hours on end, but they just kept running. And they didn't have head count that were responsible for managing the generator, making sure that it was functional. You have a trusted partner who's taking care of that, and I can just focus on my business like I always have.
Not all businesses can be run remote, it's certainly one of those scenarios where they were able to keep going.
Yeah. So now, as you look at kind of encapsulate everything and kind of bring it to a close, Lubbock was faced with a situation where, they had two decisions. It was one, really invest heavily on the capital side for a power plant and then pass all that cost on to their constituents, or, join ERCOT. As you look at the result for the community, what's your thoughts, having been in this industry for a long time and kind of, seen it evolve? Will Lubbock as a community, likely save money long term, or what's your feelings on that decision?
Yeah, I think so. Like I said, I think ERCOT has suffered for some bad PR the last couple of years, and they've done a number of things to sort of improve that. They have a good problem of sorts. It's just extensive growth. But what I love about ERCOT the most is I think it's going to lead the way in innovation on the next iteration of power grids, not only in Texas, but just everywhere. They have this massive amount of wind, way, way, way more than any other state. And it'll be interesting to see how they learn to harness that wind, how they integrate distributed energy resources, how they integrate batteries, how they deliver it efficiently and cleanly to the customer. You see Tesla relocate there. That's not by accident. They're looking at more of their utility scale stuff too. There's a lot that's driving interest in this market for good reason. I think that the market design suffered a little bit of a setback, but ultimately it still is good. And I think it's certainly superior to SPP where they came from. And in true Texas fashion, if you believe in competitive markets and that when companies compete, you win. And ERCOT seems to really show that. Residential customers, go on powertochoose.org. I think you plug in your zip code and you can sort of see a variety of suppliers that are competing for your business. Like I said, this is a commodity product. Who do you take a cheaper price? There's a lot of caveats in the contract, so I don't want to oversimplify that. But if you know what you're doing, yeah, you absolutely can navigate this and come out better on the other end.
Yeah, and the beauty again of Texas, like you mentioned earlier, is it's not an overly restrictive, state as far as innovation and iteration. So ERCOT's already kind of leading in so many areas when it comes to their energy market. It will be interesting to watch over the next 5 years and see what things are leveraged. As I follow the market, and I'm listening to things coming out of regulated states like Colorado, where they're really starting to look at, like, boy, we kind of need to look at, do we do the same thing the city of Lubbock's doing? Do we join a larger organization because of all those benefits? And, a lot of places are looking at ERCOT as kind of the example of, a lot of things that are happening, right? So, yeah, I agree with you that it looks like it's positioned, to be the best scenario for the town of Lubbock.
Yeah, these guys are all going to have to learn to be a little more quick and nimble than they have in the past. The pace of things is just it's not that slow anymore. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
distributed energy resources, DR, all that is quick.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks for your time, Barry. This has been really helpful, and just having that expertise to draw on, because this is a confusing time, and and it's something that businesses in Lubbock are. It's coming. It doesn't matter whether you're ready for it or not. You will be moved to another provider. So it's nice to have that resource to kind of help quarterback that that process. So for the community, as you're hearing this information. If you are a commercial client and you have a a reasonable size environment where you've got an energy load and reliability is important to you, we need to stay up and running when if and when the grid does go down, and we need to leverage some expertise to make sure we're protecting ourselves and we're making the right decisions as we go through this. Feel free to contact us at Exergy. Simply go to our website, exergyenergy.com. We've got a contact page that'll get you directly through to the consulting team, so we can reach out and kind of help guide that process. Follow our LinkedIn page. We have a lot of content on there. If you look up Exergy Energy on LinkedIn. More than happy to help and answer and field any questions as our community goes through this transition. It's a time of change, but it will be a good change if it's entered into correctly. So thanks again for your time, Barry. This has been helpful, and we hope this has been a valuable resource to everyone out there. But have a great day.
Thank you.